Well, welcome back to the Zeitcast, everybody. I've been especially looking forward to this episode today because one of the things that's coolest about doing a daily podcast is I have the opportunity now to be able to introduce you to all of my favorite people. So today you get to meet another one of my absolute favorite people. Malika Cox is our pastor of justice and spiritual formation at the table. And you guys, she's just such a rock star. She is one of the reasons I'm here. That's true on a couple different levels. One, because you kind of prophesied me here. I don't know what experiences everybody has about she kind of prophesied me here, so there's that. But it's also, Malika was one of the people I connected with early on where I just felt like there was such a kinship and something of the spirit. She has such a deep background working with churches, nonprofits, her experience in terms of justice, which we'll talk more about, advocacy in general, peacemaking and reconciliation is an area of special focus. There's so many things that she does well, and she is just a treasure to the table and to me and to Oklahoma City. So, Malika, it's really a big deal to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this. I definitely did prophesy you here.
You did. You really, like, before I got here, like,
yes,
you did. You first prophesied over me before I knew you. Apparently, you prophesied that I was coming here.
And then when we actually got you here, I prophesied that you needed to stay.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. So, well, so far those prophetic words are holding out.
They are, and
it's working.
We're just so happy that you're here and love you. And thank you for having me on here. And
oh, I want you to be a regular guest to be sure. I mean, it's such a, I tell people all the time, because especially when I travel, and people don't necessarily say this with shade, but sometimes it's a little bit like, why Oklahoma City exactly? And I always tell people, really, the people, it's just an extraordinary collection of people. And I think, once I got to know you guys, there was a sense of like, these are the people I would just want to build anything with. I don't care what it looks like. I don't care what form it takes. Like, these are the folks I'd want to do life with. Whatever comes out of this experiment of kind of being together in community, like I'm down for that. So, and
I agree. I feel like I've been to many places.
Yes,
we had talked about that.
5 continents, I believe.
Inside joke. But having just been traveled and been all over and been to like conflict zones and West Coast, East Coast, but I really have to say there's something about the people in Oklahoma City. Yeah. It's like salt of the earth. There's just something about the people here, and then just the community that's really organically kind of come to be over the past year.
Yes.
Which we really, I can't even imagine somehow structuring that. It's just kind of, we've cultivated community and the most amazing people have shown up, and it's really, I will say, it feels like heaven on earth. So
it is, which is interesting because it's not like we're the biggest, flashiest, sexiest thing in town, but there's such a sense of movement of the spirit, and they are especially dynamic, gifted people, and it does feel like there's something just really particular that God's doing here that's special.
I believe
so. If anybody wants to move to Oklahoma City to be part of this, that's what I did. So, there is precedent for that. Malika, I want to talk to you about a lot of things, but this is the first thing that kind of came to mind today is that the very first episode of the Zeitcast I called God at the Intersections. And so much of what we talk about is this idea of, well, it's kind of spirituality and ... And one of the things I find most fascinating about your life and story is I feel like you, from the beginning, like you have always lived at a lot of intersections. So I'd love for you just like to riff on that. At some of the intersections you, even from kind of the beginning of your life, I thought you just always lived at some very particular, really interesting intersections.
Absolutely. So I was born in Spain, which everyone always asks if my parents were Air Force, and I say no, they were gypsies. So actually my father is black and my mom is white, and they left the country at the time because there was a lot of racial unrest. And so they ended up going to Europe and traveling. They ended up in Spain, where I was born. We were there for a little while, and then we moved to California. We came back here, and I grew up in California, mostly on the beach, in Venice Beach. My dad is black, my mom's white, and I really didn't know or was aware that was actually something unique. We lived in kind of a paradise of 72 degrees and sunny on the Pacific Ocean. And one day, my parents tell me that we're moving to Oklahoma.
Wow.
And so at 8 years of age, we moved to the middle of the country. And I found out that having interracial parents actually was not only unique, but that there was a lot of I would say resistance or straight out, it was just a lot of injustice towards that. And so my parents and I moved to Oklahoma City. I like to say I discovered racism and tornadoes.
Wow, yeah.
So it's kind of like two arbitrary forces of hate or evil.
Yeah.
They're just very much like, they kind of went hand in hand. And so I ended up in the middle of the country, in the middle of the Bible Belt. I wasn't a Christian. I was a person of color. And, my parents and I, we really received a lot of kind of hostility when we would go out together as a family. And that changed over time, as I will say, Oklahoma City and Oklahoma itself has really progressed as a state. But I will say, as a person who is mixed race, I received not only racism for the fact that my parents were interracial, but just because I'm a little ethnically ambiguous. I mean, I received racial slurs for Native Americans. I received racial slurs for Latino community members. Pretty much, if you weren't white and there's a slur out there, I received it.
Wow.
So I grew up with a real understanding that there's some really unfair things in the world. And I guess I always kind of knew that I was here specifically to do something about that. Like, that's always been kind of like, this isn't right. So I would say from the age of 8, I kind of picked up the mantle of this is not right and I need to be doing something. So I will say, like, I had that as well as just not really fitting into any community. So I think that was really interesting. Either way, in either community, whether it be black or white or even the other ethnicities, I've never really felt at home. And so that has been hard, but it's also been kind of a benefit to be able to have kind of a fluid identity, in the sense that I don't understand when people get very tribalistic, because I can kind of flow to any community and I can be there and I don't get that sense of us against them as well.
That's so interesting. And I'm fascinated too that so early on that there was such an awareness, not only of the injustice, but something inside of it, like, you need to do something like that and not just run. I would kind of think if you came from California and 72 degrees and interracial marriage is not a big deal, and then you come into tornadoes and racism, that the instinct would kind of be like, check please.
And I do think there was a time where I did check out. So my mother was probably the most justice advocate. She's been arrested for civil disobedience, for anti-death penalty work, and she's been a strong advocate and activist her whole life. And so she had me out at rallies for Equal Rights Memo at like 9 years of age.
That's amazing.
Sign. And so I was that kid. And so for a while, like, that's what I knew, that's what I was put on the planet for. But I will say, as I got older and maybe it was just the wear and tear of Oklahoma, or at least the kind of powers and principalities that I see now as structural racism and white supremacy, and I think a lot of misogyny kind of wore on me. So there came a period in my life where I really did just try to escape. I escaped in the subcultures. I kind of moved around a lot. I moved to New York. I moved back to California. I moved to DC. I lived in New Orleans, which eventually led me there. And I was very purposeless and visionless, because I think I had just didn't really believe things could change. So I kind of lost my purpose, and I really did have a hostility towards, like, Christianity in particular, not necessarily faith, but Christianity, because I've been raised seeing my mom fight so hard for marginalized people. And what I saw in Christianity was like homophobia. I saw misogyny. I saw war. I saw genocide. I saw a lot of people who were out for power and money. So I was really resistant to the faith, which was kind of funny, because it would only be a few years later in New Orleans when I actually came to the faith and I became a Christian. So I would say that those things had turned me off, but I had a hunger. I really had a hunger for God. And so I started exploring that and other, like looking at Buddhist practices. I was looking kind of new agey. And so I was just really trying to find God. And then I did, but once I went to New Orleans, it was very interesting because I had my conversion there. And I really just felt like I was on this path to find God, and I ended up meeting Jesus, and it really was a kind of a tragic situation. I was living in New Orleans. I was working for a restaurant there in the French Quarter, and I really just had a sense that something bad was going to happen. And I remember telling my friends and family, and they were like, "You're just making it up." But the day that I decided not to go to work and go back to Oklahoma City, I wanted to see my family. I opened my roommate's Bible I opened the Bible for the first time, and it fell on Psalm 56, and it said, "I have kept your feet from falling so you can walk before God in the land of the living." And I remember it was just so much like a confirmation, like I needed to go back to Oklahoma City and really start working on like my life and purpose and plan. And so I didn't go to work that day. And that day was the day that 3 people were killed on a ship that I was supposed to work.
Wow.
So that was kind of like, it was so devastating because it was people I cared about, my friends Michael, Santana, and Kara. And I found out about it actually that night when I had gone home.
Ooh.
And it was one of those moments where it's just a crossroads in my life. I had raised with so much purpose.
Yeah.
And then I kind of had walked away. I kind of got disillusioned that anything could change. And I kind of fell into this purposeless life. And it was really in that moment. And I had friends who'd been praying for me, and we ended up praying together. And I really just prayed that Jesus, that he would just come in and like just be in my life. And I remember feeling like the weight of the world falling off my shoulders. I remember sensing kind of this spiritual immersion, and I just knew nothing would ever be the same. So
what was the draw towards Jesus? Like what do you think, what was the exposure, the content that would make you even think to pray to Jesus, talk to Jesus?
It's really interesting because when I was living, right before I went to New Orleans, my friends and they were all Christians. And so we would argue. I would love to debate with them. Like I would give them scientific facts and we would talk about things. But in the end, no matter what, they would always be like, Jesus is real and he loves you. And so I would be like, stop telling me this. And so there was a pushback, but they loved me and they insisted there was a God who loved me. And I really think, and that was for several years. So I had been surrounded by the people who were closest in my life, were people who were believers. And they weren't religious Christians. They were not hypocritical. They were very flawed and imperfect, but they loved well. And so I believe it was that love that really introduced me to this is what I want. And I knew there was an emptiness, and I knew there was a purposelessness. I knew that I was supposed to take that mantle again for justice. And so I kind of had that sense like I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And in just having this relationship with Jesus, I felt peace, and I felt all of a sudden like there is purpose.
So that even though your experience of Christianity had largely been negative, and you saw the church as kind of being a negative force, you talk about the homophobia, misogyny, racism, or whatever, intuitively, somehow even then you connected coming to Jesus with this sense of calling on your life towards justice as somehow moving in the same direction.
I believe so. And I believe I will say, it was the love of my friends. And the sense that I knew I was here for something. And that they were not anything like the religious kind of Christian, but I would say now evangelical kind of facades. They were true people, fallen, in the sense that they were just imperfect, like we all can be imperfect, but people who loved me. And I couldn't separate that to who they were talking about, and the fact that they truly believed that Jesus loved me. And so it really, I had to get past that kind of, that kind of witness that I had really always seen, and just be like, okay, these people are real. This love is real. And I know I'm here for something, and it's not for the life I've been living. So there was a strong conversion that happened. And eventually I found a community of faith, and I really, in a few years, I was living a life that was very different. I was going back to school. I was studying. I was in ministry. I was serving people. I started doing a lot of missions work. I was involved in a lot of helping at-risk women, which I felt like was really a passion of mine. So, I mean, it was not much time before my life was very radically different.
Yeah, wow. And how would you describe that change fundamentally? I mean, obviously the activities, like in terms of like what shifted in you.
I do think it was finding a faith community, and I think it was just really, the faith community was a spirit-filled community, and I felt like, I really spent time being in the Spirit and reading the Bible and being kind of just in communion and union with God. And even though I will look back and say there's a lot of things there that probably weren't healthy structurally, I don't think that I was very much involved in that because I was spending so much time in prayer and just meditation on the Word, and things were just changing and happening in my life left and right. So
now this brings me to a question that's really, a whole dimension of your story that's interesting to me, because you talk about kind of having this sort of mystical awakening. There's a lot of prayer, and I do see you as a person who just, has that kind of deep, very intuitive connection with God. And I mean, you don't flaunt that, but clearly a prayerful person who does walk in the Spirit. So, but I find this part so interesting, and I think this is something that a lot of people will resonate with. So you go so much of your life without any form of Christian faith. You have this encounter with Jesus kind of through a cataclysmic experience. You lose your friends, and then you meet God. Everything changes. You've got this sense of kind of purpose, destiny. You're going to school. You're doing all this justice work. Like all these things are clicking, and yet on the other side of this powerful conversion, coming into Christian community and identifying a lot of things about that were great, then you also kind of hit a wall in terms of that community. And I just think it's especially interesting when people have that kind of like real, intense, robust connection with God. But then you come to that point in your journey to where like your connection with your own faith community and your sense of where you connect to that story, or if you connect to that story, to where that doesn't necessarily make sense anymore. So what did that look like? What was it that started to unravel in terms of your experience of Christian community?
I think it's really interesting because I think it started to unravel probably around 2006, and I don't think I actually.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Exited kind of certain types of communities till closer to like 2016.
Okay.
But I do find that like when I first came in to the faith, I knew nothing about the Bible. I knew nothing about Christianity. So I kind of was like willing to go along with, I would say, believing or buying into kind of the general tenets of the American Christian faith, which I think is very different. Because I will say, and since then when I've been going to school, I traveled to Africa and Cambodia. I spent time in Jerusalem for 5 weeks doing research. And, once you get out of the Western American church, you start to see like an Eastern Christianity that's very different. And so in the beginning, it was like, okay, I kind of ate up the construction. And it was nice because there was a lot of rules. And really, I mean, as much as when you live life kind of more on your own terms, rules are great. You're like, I loved it. I was like, oh, you do this and you get that. You do this and you get that. And that's very Proverbs. And I thought, this is just great. I had this traumatic situation. My friends had died and I didn't want to ever have any more trauma again, which is completely unrealistic. But I thought, okay, I will buy into all of these rules and kind of this Christian American culture, which is very Western and a thing that isn't, if you go to the church around the globe, you don't see. And it just unraveled because it's not truth. It's not truth. You can have, you can live. I think the best way I've heard it put is you can either break yourself against kind of the laws in the universe, or you can be crushed under them trying to carry them. Either way, they crush you. So I kind of lived a life that was on my own terms, and I found it very empty and purposeless. And then I came into this rule-based Christianity, and I was loving it until you start to notice that, do good, get good doesn't work anymore.
Wow. Yeah.
Do good and get bad, or do bad and get good. And that's really where you see Ecclesiastes, and you start to see these wisdom things, the third way, where it's like the rules don't produce life.
Yeah.
And so I would say about 2006, I had kind of lived this up and down Christianity, which was like, if you keep serving and giving and doing these things for God, you're blessed. God loves you. But, what if you didn't go 10 more minutes in prayer? What if you didn't give $100 more? What if you didn't serve just a little more of the church? And then I would find this kind of up and down, manic depressive Christianity where I'm unworthy and I didn't do enough. And I didn't please God until the point where it was burnout. And I really do think that is the result of rules-based religion is burnout.
Yeah.
And that's where I found myself. And so then I remember around 2006, I started to really step away from serving the church and not completely step away from my faith community, but I really started to dig into the Gospels. And I was like, I just want to hang out with Jesus. I want to hang out with Jesus in the Gospels. I did that for a while. And I would say that I came out going, ugh, how can that community of believers have any type of political ideology which isn't compassionate and justice-minded towards the marginalized people? And there was this all sorts of, I just think hypocrisy. When I'm spending time with Jesus in the Gospels, like I don't see him fighting for gun rights. I don't see him condemning marginalized people groups. I don't see him treating women any bit less than equal. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I came away from that, and that really began to unravel. I'm like, okay, well, I knew always that I never had anything politically or really justice in mind, but I did feel like I had community and tenets of the faith. But even then, I ended up going back and getting my master's, and it's so funny because I went to get a practical theology degree, but the first year I did mostly Hebrew Bible. So then I started studying Hebrew, and then I went to Israel for the second time, and I did a class there, and I studied the culture, and I started studying the early church and the early church fathers' letters, and then I started to study these things, and all of my Western American Christianity started to wither. I mean, my views on eternal torment, my views on women in the church, my views on marginalized people's sexuality, all of these things became radically different, and so I had these kind of amazing bonds with people who helped me through traumatic situation and were loving and gracious to me. But everything that we believed it was not conducive. It was not cohesive.
Yeah.
And so I really started. And then, of course, I think this is a lot of people's story. It was when the young men who were killed by police, whether it be Trayvon Martin or Eric Garner or Michael Brown, these things were really just gut-wrenching to me.
Yeah.
And then I would see people I knew in my church flippant or out now just racist, and I realized, oh my gosh, I don't think we have the same Jesus. I'm not sure we share the brown-skinned Palestinian rabbi who lived under white Roman occupation, who showed the way of the cross, which was anti-empire. And then I just realized, and I had a friend tell me, and she, I will say she was instrumental to me really going deeper to justice. She's like, you need to decolonize your faith.
Wow.
And when I heard those words, it was like something went off on me. And I realized I had to get away from American evangelicalism. I needed to take some time, and I needed to figure out how to decolonize my faith, I think that's a lifelong process if you're living in any kind of country that's been colonized. And so that's kind of been my journey. But the beautiful thing was that the more I kind of stopped with American evangelical Christianity, the more I felt like the presence of the Holy Spirit. I found clarity on things that just never made any sense to me.
I love that.
And then just the whole election and everything that happened, it was like, to take a upside down gospel message and, put it towards a top down, right side up, worldly empire does not mesh, will never mesh.
Right.
And it becomes so clear once you leave that. And it's really almost like a blindness until you do.
Yes.
But I felt such a pull of the Holy Spirit to get out and get alone, go to the desert. And that's when I began to hear voices like you. I had been reading Richard Rohr, which of course, there's other voices that were out there, Sarah Bessey and Rachel Holt Evans, and people where I was like, oh, okay. It was like, I'm not alone out here. Because you do have that fear that you're completely alone.
Oh, totally. It's can be so alienating and scary at the time. Question I want to ask Malika in that. So one, I just find it so intriguing that there again, maybe because you had such a more mystical kind of intuitive, experiential connection to Jesus, that it seems that your disillusionment and kind of disenchantment was much more with the structure and the system than ever was with Jesus. That was the issue. The more time you're spending in the Gospels, the more acquainted you become with Jesus. Like, you're seeing this discrepancy, and which I think is interesting, that it's actually Jesus is the one who illumines this, as opposed to. So I'm fascinated by that. I'd love for you to say a bit more, just for people who may not be on that journey or be familiar with this language, as to what it meant for you to decolonize your faith. What that word means, and what specifically that's looked like for you to decolonize.
Absolutely. And I think that, it's very interesting. We live in a country that has been colonized by Western Europe and Western civilization. And the indigenous people here do not obviously prescribe to Western values or religion or politics. So this is colonized land, and it's really stolen land. And sometimes, we don't really acknowledge that we're living on stolen land, that we're colonized settlers. I mean, that's just something that I think we have to grapple with. And that's probably the first step in decolonizing the faith, is like, okay, even if 33%, I did my DNA, I'm 33% African, 65% European, and 2% Asian.
Interesting.
Even though there's a good chunk of me that is an involuntary minority, I still live on stolen land.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the big thing you have to understand, is like that is not good. So once you start to do that, and then the second thing you really have to know is, I studied a lot of the Eastern Church, so this was actually very helpful. Like for me, just studying the East when it comes to Christianity, is that the Westerners were just doers, and American Christianity is so about doing. It's not about being or becoming or transforming. It's about doing a behavior modification, obeying the rules, getting power. And so the first thing in decolonizing is that you have to stop doing. And that's the hardest thing, because the first instinct is, how do I fix this? How do I help the poor? Because you want to be somebody who is aligned with the marginalized. But one of the worst things, and I will say that I was a part of kind of this American evangelical Christianity, is you can really be involved with toxic charity. And so what I really learned that I had to get to was, in doing good works, what you do is you recognize the asymmetrical power dynamics. So if you have a group here and a group here, and you're trying to give asymmetrically, you're going to feel really good about yourself. And you're probably going to have a photo op, and there's going to be a lot of press. And the person who's receiving is probably going to get something simple, tangible for a day, be in the same situation the next day. There's nothing empowering about that. So for me, it was like, what needs to happen here? Well, I need to first recognize that marginalized people are often marginalized because of power structures and powers and principalities. So the goal isn't to fix somebody; it's to come alongside and recognize that even if you're marginalized, you probably are thriving with less. And what does that look like? That is amazing gifts and resilience and creativity. So then it's like coming alongside and then realizing nobody is above or below. We need to come together to deal with the systems. And that was the second thing in decolonizing, is that you've got to be able to understand systems. So systems, which I had a friend say recently, is policies and laws, institutions, structural things that have been put aside. And I think that's what every prophet, I loved what you talked about on Sunday, because Jeremiah and Isaiah and these guys came along and they're like, they're talking to, at that point, government and religion married, which I think we have in America as well. And it is like we're dealing with these powers and these principalities, these structures like white supremacy, like patriarchy, all of these things are coming along. And until you recognize that, you're not decolonizing your faith. Once you realize that, so then you really have to just start to renew your mind. And that's what Paul, I think it was Paul, who talked about don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by renewing your mind. The transformation process is coming to a place where I believe justice is what God wants. And Amos 5:20 says, justice, that's what I want. That's all I want.
Yeah.
And it's like we get to this point where, and that's what I felt like I was called way before I became a Christian. God put me on this planet to stand against injustice.
Wow.
That has always been my call. That will always be my call. That will always be, I believe, the church's call.
Yes. By the way, if y'all want to book Malika in to preach a revival at your church, I would highly recommend it. Like, this is so good. Like, there's such a fire in your bones in that way. It's good. It was interesting too, because I was thinking about how, even when we talked about this conversation today, we were talking about like, hey, because I want to have Malika on as a regular guest, like, I want her and Cece both in the mix, several folks in our table community. But it's interesting to remember talking about like, hey, well, maybe we'll talk about your story today, or we could talk about justice and peacemaking, or maybe those would be two different episodes, just realizing how like, for you, it's always been one story. It's always been one story. Jesus, justice, the call in your life, even before you recognize it as Jesus. It was always kind of the same thing. There's so many threads here I love to follow. I mean, the decolonizing stuff, if I can just add a footnote here, again, for people who may not be on this journey, but I feel like, because I'm so aware right now of the amount of resistance there are to any of these words that sometimes are unfamiliar for people. And I feel like what often happens is that, and it's so interesting how this narrative is it's subtle, it's not always explicitly stated, but it's so real. I just like, especially if you're white, if you grew up in a more white evangelical context, the messaging that you're always getting, even if you're doing good work, if you're doing charitable work, maybe it's toxic charity, but some form of charity in the world, everybody else out there has a culture. But there's this idea that whiteness is bland, vanilla, culture-free. We have no culture. We don't come from anywhere or anybody. We have no history. We have no story. We're an ahistorical people. Like, there's no sense of how we got here. There's no reflection on the land at all, where it came from. Oftentimes, there's really no sense of even history of the church either. Like, ahistorical people all the way around, following an ahistorical Jesus. We're the only ones who've ever been here, and we're making up this story as we go. So then when you start hearing language like decolonizing, like, all these things sound very radical and scary because we don't have a culture. Right. I mean, we're just objective. Everybody else has a culture, and where they live and where they come from and their story and heritage. Well, that informs and of course, often said with a bit of condescension, well, of course, that's going to shape how they feel and think. But we don't have a particular story. We don't come from anybody or anywhere. And I think that, that whole call to decolonize, you have to reflect on, okay, I come from somewhere.
Yes.
I'm part of a larger story. My faith community is part of a larger story. My country's part of a larger story. And finding like where you fit in. I don't mean to get preachy about that. To your story though, Malika, because I feel like this is so interesting, especially given what we're doing now. So like when you hit this wall and you're decolonizing your own faith and you're going through this journey, and you're learning theologically and you're growing and expanding. So am I correct in assuming here, like for a while, like did faith community have a role? Like, because obviously the communities you come from, and I feel like you try to speak honorably about that, but that wasn't working the same way anymore. Right. I mean, like, did you come to a place where you weren't sure whether or not church fit into your own story, like at least in kind of a local expression?
Well, I went to Ireland for a year, and I did my master's in conflict resolution and reconciliation, and it was a lot of actually studying like war, conflict, and atrocity. And so I, having studied that, I came back very it was just like very awakened to what the world can be and what the world can do and what religion and politics can do. And so when I came back, I couldn't go back into anything that looked like religion married to politics.
Yeah.
And so I actually will say that I felt this real pull to go to this sweet little Episcopal church in my neighborhood. And thought that was strange because, I mean, the Episcopalians are very different than kind of evangelicals.
Sure.
And then I found out, I had read How to Survive a Shipwreck, and you had started going there, and that gave me kind of like a confidence. It's like, okay, that this is really maybe the spirit. And then I read, Rachel and other people were saying, they kind of found themselves at like Episcopal churches. And I started going, and I would sit in the pew, and it was so funny because it's so radically different from the charismatic kind of youth culture type church. I mean, there were so many people there with gray hair, and there was ritual, and there was the sacraments, and I remember just weeping every time. And they were just the nicest people. Like, actually, if you were to go to a group of people who never heard of Christians, it would be like, you would talk about Jesus, and you'd expect, and then you would meet the Episcopalians, and you're like, that's what Christians should be like. So it was so amazing to see like these sweet, nice, mostly older, just lovely people who loved Jesus and were about social justice, and I kind of understood where they were at politically, and I'm not saying everybody was monolithic, but it was such refreshingness, and so I found kind of a little home and healing in that community. Now, it didn't find a lot of diversity, and for me that's important. So and so I would say that kind of journeyed me, and then it was just like, I was like, you know what, and I felt like I just felt the Spirit being like, just relax, like just rest. And that had been always such a thing for me, like rest and supernatural rest. And I think that's so important in our faith. And even in Hebrews 4:11, it talks about the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any two-edged sword. But you got to go back to 4:9 and 4:10, which talks about the only work is to enter the rest. So I really believe once I rested, I took this break, which people don't even, I mean, it's crazy to think I took a break from church, I took a break from praying, I took a break from community. And it was almost in that rest that the Word of God became alive and active.
That's interesting.
And it was like, then I was able to kind of allow the Holy Spirit, that whole river, eternal current, like things just started to happen. Like I ran into Nicole. I hadn't seen Nicole in a while. And I met Cece. And then I hadn't seen Nicole in a while. I met Nicole, and I introduced Nicole to Cece. And then it was like just these little things. And I met Reese. And it was like all of these people that started coming in my life. It was so much more effortless. There was so much more of flow. And I really had decided, and we can talk two trees sometime, but I really started to kind of meditate on these two differences between the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it was like, I felt all of a sudden like I was living from the tree of life. And then, I had found How to Survive a Shipwreck, which literally midwife. And I had known about you and followed you for a while, but that book midwifed me out of kind of the exodus of what was no longer healthy for me. And so then when Nicole and I had met up, we're like, do you want to do something? And the first time I was like, oh, heavens no. Like, I don't want community. And then I had something happened, and it was like I had gone to a church service, and I was like, I need something with more diversity. I need something. And so Nicole and I got back together again, and she's like, I was like, well, I've been reading this book, and she's like, I'm reading that book. And then we both had said, I said, well, I went to go see something in Tulsa called The Table, Jonathan Martin. She's like, oh my God, I was checking that out. And then we're like, well, let's do that. Let's just do The Table. And then we were like, well, let's just get Jonathan here.
And it's funny because you're saying that fast, but this happened over time.
Yeah, it did.
Because I remember when I met you at The Table in Tulsa.
It was like February 2017, maybe?
Yeah, something like that.
A years ago,
because I remember you came. And Nicole never came, did she? I didn't think so. But you visited. You offered the whole drive, an hour and a half. And so but I love to tell people that, because, The Table truly did exist before I got here. I mean, y'all, it's still a labor of love, so nobody's exactly hired. But y'all hired me, not the other way around, to come be part of your thing.
We're kidnapped you.
We're kidnapping.
You're coming here.
But that was so fun when I first found out, when I first connected Nicole. It's like, oh, so there's a table in Oklahoma City. There's this thing that's happening. And it's just so interesting that something kind of felt like my DNA was kind of already in it before I got here. but that y'all were already connecting around these ideas. I just think, it's so interesting to me that after having this disillusionment with Christian community here that often felt nationalistic and felt like it was marrying religion and politics in an unhealthy way. No, but the fact that you had been disillusioned with the expression of Christian community you had found here in terms of this unhealthy marriage of religion and politics, and which another story for another time. Part of what's I think is most frustrating about that is those same church expressions I know, they're always going to say they're not political. And that's what's frustrating because they're the most political overtly, and yet they pretend they don't have politics. Just like whiteness involves this assumption that you have no culture. These churches are very political, but claim they have no politics. But
and I will say for me, like coming to that decolonization point was the fact that I realized we're all political.
Yes,
there is no not political.
Right,
and if you pretend to not be, that's because you're privileged.
Yes.
And that was the problem with a lot of these spaces where they were so privileged so they could pretend to not be involved. And yet personally, everybody was very involved.
Very involved.
It was gut-wrenching for me.
This is the thing that's most got me beating my head against the wall right now is how many people I feel like I'll talk to who claim that they're not political or that what we're doing in terms of justice is political. It's like, you guys, like every sermon, every talk, everything, like there's a worldview that's so explicit, not only political, but is expressly political in a partisan way. Because I don't think that's what we're doing.
No,
we're like,
I don't think we're doing
let's
that at
come
all.
be political in a Jesus way in terms of we believe that what we believe about Jesus and our faith should inform what we do in the world. So in that regard, it's political. But it has nothing to do with partisan politics. This is about moving from right to left or whatever else. But this is about working out our faith in real life.
Right.
But I just think like it's so interesting to me that you come from a place where you have that kind of disillusionment to then find the courage to carve out a new space when you don't even know what that space would look like. And I love that you drove by this, but I think this is interesting. And I say it in a way not to be to speak with any negativity towards anybody else, because actually I feel like this is a common important part of the story, that I love these safer kind of mainline spaces where there's a kind of sense of sanctuary. I think that's beautiful. And I found that too. I did write about it in Shipwreck, and I love that. But I do find, not always, but I do think a lot of times, people will come into those kind of spaces and they'll find a sense of sanctuary that's good, and they'll find something that's tender and that's healing and nurturing for the soul, but that lacks the kind of diversity that we need. And if you don't have diversity, then no matter what you say about justice, no matter how much you might claim to value different expressions, what does that really mean when if the form is never going to be such to where anybody who's not white, or in some of those cases kind of a older wealthy white, are ever going to find their way into the church? So I just think, so it's just so interesting then that you find yourself in a place where then you're now carving out a kind of faith space that you'd never really experienced. Because and a part of that resonates, that's been so much my journey. It's like it's so strange when you're trying to create something, start something that you've never really been on the receiving end of.
Right.
Like I've not been in something like this before. So how do you know how to lead something when you've not been in it before?
And I think that's what we're doing, because we're literally I think we're flowing in that river, because so much of this has been organic.
Yes.
Just the fact that when you came, everything was like such. We didn't offer you a big title and a huge salary. We offered you zero salary.
Well, you did offer me a title, in fairness. No salary, but we've got titles. We'll give anybody a title. We got titles, like we'll just,
super fancy. But everything's come together, and the people, it's like there's this authenticity. There's this hunger to be together.
Yes.
They're like, we spent, I remember one service we showed up at 4, and we went to it was a house service, but it went to people were leaving at 10 or 11. Like people are so hungry to be together.
Yes.
And it is because I think there's this flow and there's this lack of rules. It's relationship. And you're right. We don't really know what we're doing. Yeah. But it's producing life. And that's the thing. And I feel like as long as we see life and we see this beauty, authenticity, and love.
Yes.
And these other mainline situations, you're right. I mean, there is the sanctuary and there's rest and there's care, but I liked what you said about the other day when we were filming that, you have to have people who don't necessarily agree with you, people who are different, people you have to work to kind of overcome. And so I feel like we've kind of carved out a space where we do see different people coming in, different people of races and faiths, and we have people with different sexuality orientations and people who are we have friends with people who don't consider themselves Christians.
Sure.
I mean, people are coming and they're like, I'm kind of an existential phase right now, or maybe a Unitarian. I don't really know. And it's like, okay, so we see kind of these different people coming in, and there's a space for that. And I really do think, with all my heart, as much as we're hurt in community, we heal in community.
That's so important. That's so important.
So important.
But people are scared to death. And I get it, you know, and I don't want to impose something before people are ready. But I feel like especially people who have been hurt in community, like understandably, the tendency is you kind of want to isolate and insulate yourself because you're afraid if you put yourself back out there, then your heart's going to be broken. Well, there's always that real risk involved. But that's the thing. It's like, it's not, for me, it's not legalism. It's not shame. It's not like, I mean, that's a wonderful verse and all, but I'm not coming from like the old Hebrews, like, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together. Like, there's no tisk. It's that principle. It's that if you've experienced a certain kind of brokenness in context of a community, how will healing come any other way except within a community?
But through a community that has devoted itself to authenticity, love, and inclusion. I really believe that's, for me, I will say this. I have healed in our community.
Yeah.
I am not bitter. I'm not looking backwards. I am healed and I am moving forwards. And I do not believe that could have come without our community.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be our community, but I do think it has to be a community. And you want to be sure that there's no hypocrisy and kind of things going on, but I do think that that's the journey, and that's the journey as a human being. Let's face reality. If we shut ourselves down to all harm and hurt, we shut ourselves down to all love and
absolutely
hope. So I mean, it's always going to come down to, sure, there's seasons of rest and retreat, and there's seasons of drawing in, but just like water, it's going to be stagnant unless it flows back out.
Yes. So I'm just thinking about how, because I know we need to wrap up, and for sure we're going to do more of this together. I know everybody's going to be requesting more Malika after today. But I'm just thinking about how, and again, there's no judgment in this whatsoever, but how especially, there's that wonderful story in the Gospels of Jesus and the man who's waiting to be made well by the pool of Bethesda, and there's the myth that if you're thrown in the water, but the question, Jesus, He's been in this paralyzed condition for 38 years, and yet Jesus asked him, do you wish to be made well? And I do think in a very gentle, tender way. I don't think there's any ugliness there. There's no nasty, like, do you want to get better or not? That's not the spirit of it. It's not, Jesus is not Dr. Phil, but I think there's something about that question, like, do you wish to be made well? Are you willing to step towards wholeness? Because I think, like, it is an easy decision and an understandable one to stay bitter, to stay isolated, to stay alone. I just think that's the invitation of the Spirit for so many people right now is, hey, do you wish to be made well? I know there's risk here, but will you come and try to mend with us and create something new with us? This has been so special, Malika. Thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you so much.
We're absolutely going to do this again. So
I would love that.
Thanks for tuning in for the Zeitcast. We so appreciate it if you like, share, review, get the word out in any form. It's so helpful to us right now. You can support us on Patreon. There's a link via jonathanmartinwords.com. As always, I'm thankful that you guys are with us, and we will see you again tomorrow. Take care, you guys.